my focus is obviously in the financial industry, wealth management. During the pandemic, obviously there were shutdowns. People weren't able to leave their homes, and advisors had to figure out a way to connect with clients. And so they started using Zoom and Skype and Teams and so on and so forth. But there's always this need to do more, right? To have a more sociable connection than, perhaps like a static frozen screen via whatever application you're using. And that was when I would say VR got very popular within that industry, at least talk of it did. And there are a few firms now out there that are experimenting with different things. Like the goggles is interesting. So the fact that even if you now bring a client into your office, you can use goggles to create a certain experience for them, right? A hologram is another technology that I've heard of where you can be, if you're, let's say, a taxation professional on the West Coast and you're meant to meet with a client in Ontario, you can just like beam into this box now and there's a hologram of you and it looks like you're right there. Which is really fascinating. And you've done a fair bit of work with this technology. So I'm very curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so there are a lot of potential in VR. As you were mentioning, like recently the most exciting thing happened in the VR research industry. And what is that? Apple announced the Vision Pro, the Apple, because that whenever Apple announces something, that consumers are going to pick it up, right? So that was one of the most exciting days in VR research, right? But what you mentioned, like the sense of presence in because VR or augmented reality, like we usually call it XR, which is like extended reality. It's like extending your reality itself, right? So in XR, like of course, like the sense of immersion is a big thing, right? That you can, like as you were saying, that if you're in a meeting room, you can essentially be in remote places and like just beam them into that place, like with either with holograms or with like VR headsets and whatnot, right? So technologically, there's a lot of potential, right? So, but you will see that the uptake is a bit slow because of the expense required. Currently, the expense is the biggest issue, right? So, like one of the concerns I have with VR uptake is that this actually interestingly came up in one of the studies that we did. And it again goes back to like touching on many different things that we have discussed before. Like the project is, we're doing a project with the Holland Brookview Hospital in Toronto, right? So this in this project, what we are trying to do was, again, it came during the pandemic that Holland Brookview has a big patient population on the autism spectrum, right? So they need a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy, right? So that therapy is one-on-one with the doctor. It needs a lot of time. During pandemic, there was a lot of disruption, and these kids need therapy on a regular basis, right? So as an engineer, I wrote the research proposal, of course, first, and I got too excited. I'm like, oh, you know what? We're just gonna do it in VR, right? And we're just gonna use AI to assess the emotional state of the kids, and then just gonna solve it, everything. Very adventurous. Then I sent it to my clinician partner, and her first response was that, are you crazy, right? Like that. Because there are so many issues there, right? Like to unpack it one by one, right? First thing is that with VR, going back to my first point, like digital divide is a big issue in VR, right? Because first thing that my clinician partner, she mentioned is that you can't just do it in VR. You have to do it on tablets. You have to do it on computers. Because a lot of these kids can't afford a VR headset. Because if you're thinking about home-based CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, like they can't buy a $400 headset. Like now for the research study, you may buy it and like you may buy 10 headsets and then do a data collection, show that your research is working well. But what will be the uptake? What is the point of that, right? So, my concern with like in general for immersive reality is that it is great in terms of increasing the sense of presence. Currently, we're doing the data collection for that, and the kids really love the VR experience and whatnot, right? So, but my concern is that like it's gonna basically increase the digital divide a lot more, right? Because unless we can bring the prices down, make commodity hardware that can go to everyone and everyone can access the hardware as easily as possible, right? It's gonna just increase the digital divide among us, right? So that's number one, right? And number two, the point that in that project that was brought up was that the sense of social isolation in like immersive reality, right? So if we get too comfortable with this, we're all gonna become like, that movie Wall-E, right? So we're all gonna become like just sit on a chair, like wear our goggles and just go around like that, right? And that can create a lot of social isolation issues, right? I know that after post-pandemic, there's already so much social anxiety among people. You don't want to be in a crowd, right? You just want to go back home and stay in a room. These things have become an issue, right? So with the advent of this XR, right, we actually have to pay very close attention to it. That again, I think the main thing is these two are very closely tied, right? Since I work in both spaces, AI and XR, right? You have to have human drivers behind it, right? So for the health, the CBT application, what we are doing is that the clinician will always be on call, right? They will walk the kid through the VR experience, right? And then they will talk to the kid meanwhile the kid is doing, so that they don't feel alone, they don't feel lost, they don't feel nervous in the experience, because you are doing like sensitive exposure therapy here, so you can't just have like technology take over, right? So I think this applies equally to these both spaces, that as long as you have a human driver behind it, it's okay. So the examples that you provided, like office meetings, like very, very good examples of XR applications, right? But again, we have to be careful that the human drivers are always behind the technology, and the technology is not like taking over autonomously.
That makes sense. And I think you mentioned immersiveness, and I learned about that a while ago, and I find it really interesting that the way our brains have developed is that we really can't. There's no distinction between what you experience with a VR headset in virtual reality versus what you experience in real life. So, for instance, if I were to go on a roller coaster at Canada's Wonderland, that experience versus if I were to go on a roller coaster with that VR headset would be very similar. Like my brain wouldn't really know how to differentiate those two memories. It would be as if I was on a roller coaster both times. And I think that has some ethical implications, particularly when you are speaking about office meetings, when you are speaking about, advisors and clients, in the sense that, can this technology be taken advantage of where the advisor presents this beautiful dream? Let's say you go into their office and they show you this beautiful island that they want to plan for you so that you can go on vacation, for 6 weeks every year. Just that once you retire, right? Just as an example. Now, what are the possibilities of that actually happening or that not happening? It could all be done in very good faith, but just the fact that you've use this technology to implement this very real vision into this person, I find a bit concerning. And obviously, there's been other issues with when VR headsets are used and different occurrences that can happen that can cause trouble or trauma for people. So just how do we sort of mitigate some of that, and how do we, I suppose, become better at using this technology so that it doesn't affect us as much, if that's even possible?
These are all like very good points, right? In terms of because I think what we were mentioning was that how the VR spaces can be used in bad faith, right? Like in metaverse, there was a lot of things about sexual abuse and whatnot. Because when you go into a VR space, you think that there is no consequence to your actions, but there are humans sitting behind the other VR headsets. So there are obviously, even if it's two avatars, there are consequences to things you are doing, right? So I think going back to the things that we have discussed from an AI point of view, I think those things equally apply here, right? Like basically the raising the awareness, right? That we are going into a much more immersive environment. It can be addictive. It can take a toll on your mental health, right? Raising awareness. The technology developers providing putting more regulations on them, right? Like having a governing body for XR, right? So IEEE recently came up with saying this IEEE is the engineering institute, right? So that came up with this ethical list of ethical considerations that you have to take to develop XR applications. So accessibility is a big part of it. Then this ethical considerations is a big part of it. Don't make things addictive, right? So again, I think those things because those are just guidelines, right? So I think those guidelines need to become laws, like there need to be regulatory bodies that that looks at these things, and above all, I think we have to have like education of XR, like because XR, like if you look at the hype cycle, XR is like still a little behind AI, right? So, but it's gonna catch up, right, with the things that are coming up. So I think if we start now and educate people about the the bad consequences of this type of technology, I think that's how we can kind of develop a more like healthy solution to these things.
Definitely, we definitely need to look more in this area because it is very emerging and there's a lot of considerations to be thought of.